So for all my sins, I'm a consultant at Black Marble. Bit of a jack of all trades, really. I started out in test many years ago, gradually moving into kind of a deployment engineer role, and then out of that, ultimately in development. BizTalk developer primarily, again, for all my sins. So, this isn't a very slide-heavy deck. Predominantly, we're going to be doing a lot of demos. But first things first, DevOps. This is one of my boss Rick's favorite metaphors to illustrate the question, what is DevOps? Four blind men doing things to an elephant, which could be misconstrued under the wrong circumstances. However, one man will feel the trunk, one man will feel tail, he'll say a brush, he'll say a hose. Everyone's got the wrong idea, it's an elephant. To me, DevOps personally is about automating as much as everything and getting ultimately so our software gets out to customers more quickly. However, there's also very much a culture and patterns part of that, which I'll not get too much into. I believe that's for my counterparts on the Microsoft side to get into. I'm going to be talking about tooling predominantly today. However, Donovan Brown, praise be his name, does sum it up quite nicely. So I will leave with this quote, which I'll come back to at the end with counterpoint. DevOps is the union of people, process, and products to enable continuous delivery of value to our end users. Sufficiently vague, but also hitting the key points. So, everyone's seen some variation of this diagram over the years. The development lifecycle. Develop, build, deployment, testing, bugs, back to develop, not necessarily bugs, but new features, in a continuous loop. Back in the day, this used to take considerably longer before we started thinking about modern DevOps methodologies. Deployments historically quite painful, leading to a gradually accruing technical amount of time and debt on projects. I've personally been on projects like that where a lack of good DevOps practice has caused us nothing but headaches. And this is what, we want to make the round time on these trips, ideally, small as possible. So, where do you start with this? Well, tooling will take you so far. Again, that's what I'm going to jump into, no surprise there, but essentially, golden rule, automate everything you can. So, everyone over the years has seen Microsoft's, very nicely provided boilerplate demonstration solutions. So, this one's good old-fashioned Fabricam with a couple of mild customizations. So, this is held in, the source code for this is held in Git, in a VSTS repo. So, historically, we were a TFS/TFVC customer, until ultimately Git rose to power, and we got tired of doing our own internal TFS upgrades, so we migrated. We liked having the newest features pretty much as soon as they came out. Point I want to make here is source control platform. Ultimately, there's still nothing wrong with TFVC for customers who are still deeply embedded in it, but should be looking to new technologies going forward. These short life cycles of iterations of feature development work better when branches, I feel, are treated as a lightweight construct. When TFVC, at least in my experience, treats them as far too long-living and a bit heavyweight to create. So one of our current most operandis when I'm on site is if a customer isn't using Git for new projects, that's where I often say, have you considered trying this? But don't just feel the need to upshift and move. If it's not necessarily too broken, don't fix it. Right, so I said I pulled this out of Git. Now, I might do some command line stuff here. I'm a big fan of posh Git. This is predominantly because as I said earlier, I'm a BizTalk developer, and I do a lot of work in 2013 R2, and the Git tooling in Visual Studio 2013 is okay. So, old habits die hard. Now, my boss Rick likes making a point that configuration, default configuration for an application, when we pull out of source code, a developer immediately wants to hit F5 and have this thing go. Now, on a Surface Book, assuming I've got the right function key selected, nope, that's good old-fashioned volume control. Thank you. I should just be able to hit this build and roll an instance of my website. For feature development, debugging locally, this is the developer's everyday work story. Now, we've made a few slight changes to this when it comes up so that we can always identify this is running in a developer workstation. Has anyone ever met Drew Robbins? Is he fictional, or did he live? So, first thing, you'll notice we have a little, this is where we've got config kind of trickling up to the UI. Quite clear in what environment we're at the moment. We're deving. And the other thing I'm always quite fond of, and you can see my my co-worker, Rick, who was demoing last week, has been in the code base here. We're modifying that. But the point I want to draw attention to is version 1. At Black Marble, we've at least since I've been working there 6 years ago, we have a golden rule. Never, ever deploy version 1 assembly to production or test any environment outside of development. Everything is strongly versioned. But we leave everything as version 1 while usually in development. Bar change, major version number increments in the code base. Now, if I want to make a development change, if I want to make a change to this, which I'm going to, I'm going to jump into the correct version of Visual Studio, for I have several. And I'll make a little tweak. Oh, I've got a cheeky sense of humour about me sometimes. Now, so, funny that, get that. So, I'm going to take some source control. I've developed this critical new feature that's want to get out of the business as soon as possible. Now, if I was a good egg, and I was always employ you to be a good egg, there should be properly associated with a work item, which we would create in TFS, and so we want to associate the change set with something trackable, which Q&A can have a look at. Now, we use an extension back in us was on primary VSTS instance, which compiles our release documentation based on the work items that are in the change sets between major build releases. This would be driving it. Now, I'm going to actually be a little bit naughty here for the purpose of this demonstration, and not associate with this work item. So, I come and checked in. Now, everyone in this day and age should be ensuring they've got a continuous build process. Now, I've seen many times on customer sites a differentiation between CI and release builds. Some people prefer to have their CI build is their release build. I'm more of the school that I like a CI build to be quick and dirty. I want to check the code base compiles. I've got a lot of bespoke logic which makes my builds take longer, which I want to keep separate in release build, which I'll only kick off when I'm ready. Now, again, for the purposes of this, I think we have definitions. We only have the single build definition, a simplification, if you will. Now, I tells you, it's been around for a few years now, but when the new build system came in, I was overjoyed, because I used to, who here remembers the good old XAML templates? And before that, your custom MS build target files. I was just around the beginning when they were still around. Well, the first time I saw one in production on a customer site, I was quite astounded, I tell you. So, you'll see that build number. We're setting that by some logic in the build definition name, using some of the pre-existing variables that are available to us through VSTS. Now, this is what's going to be stamped by some custom tasks. I'll tell you what, let's go and view the build definition. I'll show you those standard tasks. I figure I've got a minute or two before that finishes. So, we love standard tasks. We've created quite a few of our own. We've published quite a few of them in the marketplace for general use by anyone. quite often, when I'm on a customer site, I'm installing our own extensions into their TFS or VSTS instance, just so I can put build definitions that adhere to how we do things, back at Black Marble, in place. So, first things first, after doing a NuGet restore, version our assemblies. We're running some black magic regex in there that takes the build definition name and clips our build definition, our build number out of it. And we set that in the build options. Bit of a complex function. I could tell you a funny story of how this this used to be organized a little bit differently, which involved we stopped doing when we broke BizTalk. Turns out there's a small int somewhere in a table somewhere. Doesn't appreciate anything over 32,000 being put in, give or take. That's applied by that standard task to every assembly.cs file, and if we're using a .NET Core project, the project.json file, ensuring that everything that is version 1 in this project is versioned accordingly with the build definition. What this gives us is, if for whatever reason, in case of, let's say, forensics, we need to track down what version of a build a particular assembly came from in production, we can go all the way back to the build definition, because the build numbers will match the assembly version numbers. Oh, we have a couple of these version tasks, depending on what technology we're working with. Another thing we're quite fond of doing is DAC packs. That's our standard methodology for deploying database and has been for a few years. They are also a versionable artifact. And by the way, I implore you, if you haven't explored some of the versioning, some of the magic you can do with DAC packs after you version them and you enable the version catalog in SQL, have a look. I'll not get into that because that's really off the beaten track, but most customers I've seen that have dedicated SQL devs are still just checking SQL scripts into source control, and there are better ways. So, as part of any build, we are of course wanting to do some basic tests. Now, I said if this was part of my CI build, I'd probably want to run unit tests. Now, the Microsoft provided standard task allows us to essentially set an object mask on tests assemblies we want to execute. So we implement a naming convention in our solution for different type of tests where we have. And we try to cover all our bases. Everyone, you might know the difference between unit tests, integration tests, automated UI tests. Ultimately, we're trying to make sure this thing will test itself out of the box, so that we have a minimum level of confidence in the solution after it deploys, especially between releases. Now, at this point, I'm only interested in running unit tests. And so that's what our standard task does. And then we have our standard publisher drop. Now, at this point, I have a versioned build artifact, but where do I deploy it to? Now, it's no knock on Microsoft here, but a couple of years ago, Satya Nadella and a lot of the across to Microsoft at some of the build events were showing off the deployment tooling improvements in Visual Studio for deploying to Azure. Oh, deploy directly from Visual Studio. That is a big no. Great if you're deploying to some sort of integrated development environment where you want to do some tests, but not suitable for production. You would never deploy from VS. So, again, it's VSTS to the rescue, though. Now, it's not the only competing product in the market. We have similar products. You have Octopus Deploy, Chef, and Puppet, allowing you to do much the same in terms of this is an orchestrator. So, we have a release definition. Now you can see this has been kicked off automatically by our build having completed, but our deployment configuration in this particular instance is not defined as part of a solution, but another solution. So best place for, I suppose, deploying a web app these days for quick and dirty testing would be Azure. Now, Microsoft did the entire world a favor when they brought in the ARM templating features into Azure. So before that, you had the classical model where everything was handled a little bit differently depending on which part of Azure you were talking to. ARM was the unifying framework that allowed us to manipulate all of Azure. Now, I will confess, unlike my boss Rick, who did the last one of these events, I am not an expert when it comes to ARM templates. However, I will briefly talk you over some of the particulars. So, much like any deployment script, we set our ARM templates to accept various parameters which allows the template to behave differently depending on which parameters are injected to it. So by environment, we supply different parameters. ARM is a declarative language, for lack of a better phrase. So what we actually define in the template is, in this case, we want a web app container. What access rights we want, what scale, billing. One setting up for SQL Azure, various bits and bolts. The key point I want to kind of cover here is using a parameters file in your ARM templates rather than hard coding. Otherwise, you are going to end up in somewhat of a situation where different templates for different environments, which kind of defeats the point and increases the onus on yourselves for managing multiple configurations in source control. I myself found a very similar story early in my career when I was working with websites. So I'm going to jump back to our.
Does this help me deploy configuration changes without doing new builds?
Yes. So ARM is. Oh, what's the word? Thank you. The pronunciation always gets me. So it's if I have an instance already deployed, the template essentially it's a bit like how PowerShell DSC works. It attempts to ensure that whatever's deployed there complies to a template I'm applying. Now the attraction here of keeping template configuration and code separate is if I had these in a single solution, for example, and I made a configuration change, I would have to generate a new build which would contain my my deployment process. So if I was using PowerShell scripts, for example, and I was referencing my release definition in those scripts, a new build every time I made a config change, just to get those changes out into my deployment pipeline, holding them separately in a separate solution, and in this case, even indeed a separate Git repo. I can deploy the same source code out over and over again without rebuilding it, but with changes made in my configuration. So I mentioned some time ago when I was but a green, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, green around the ears, little deployment engineer back at Black Marble. It's probably about 2 years into my career. We had a website for a customer, which obviously we had different environment configurations for them. Now I started working with the set parameters XML deployment method, that's IIS, and web packages. Sorry, I think the overall technology is called MS Web Deploy, allows you to work with. Now, what I ended up doing was having a different environment set parameters file for each environment held in source control, and this was fine when we only had, say, 3 to 4 environments. When we then rolled on to deploying the website for another customer, however, they had their own set of 4 environments and a whole different branch of the code. Now, I ended up realizing I was going to be facing down an entire proliferation of config files held in source control, which, well, Rick at the time then smacked me with the back of the head and said, "What were you thinking?" In the kindly father way that he has, if anyone here has ever met him. However, implementation aside, the fact is I was right in generating a set parameters file. So for deploying websites, this is kind of nice in that essentially the parameters is a XPath queries for how to change various values in your web config or app config. Now, what my old boss, Richard Fennell, again, if any of you have ever heard of him, he liked kind of what I did to some extent, and decided to write an extension that when we pointed a web config file, he has an update for 2017, so I do apologize in advance for that, we can generate this parameters XML file from an existing app.config or web.config file. So it'll write all the various XPath queries for you. Similar to how we manage the ARM template parameters, our deployment pipeline will actually do no, we don't want to generate that. Shush. It will actually substitute the parameters for the environments in a deployment time. So I have one template file which tells me how to find the parameters, but I use tokens, which I replace with good old string manipulation at deployment time, to make sure that the right values are in depending on where I'm deploying to. So rather than having separate config, my release pipelines for each customer have the responsibility of storing the correct parameters, which of course gives me the advantage of VSTS using secure variables, or if I have other secure secrets, I can perhaps integrate with things like key storage and for pulling secrets out. Ultimately, onus isn't on me for storing these things in source control, where they will just start ultimately cluttering up the solution. Now, if I come back to after a long circumventions chat, I come back to our integration environment. I see this one is a little bit more chatty than, I don't know if I'm caught a glimpse, our test environment, which only had about three tasks. So, first thing we do, create and update one of our resource groups, where we're actually going to be deploying this instance of the website to. Now, this integration environment is not long-lived. I'll tell you that now, so I can't browse to it. This is because after we've done a deployment, so again, I talked about replacing tokens in parameters file, that's what this task's doing, and we've deployed our ARM template, held in the other solution. We execute a series of integration tests. So I mentioned that we have, trying to cover multiple bases. We have coded UI tests. We use web tests for the web test framework, if anyone's not used it. Unsung hero of, I would say, of part of the Microsoft test stack, in that it's absolutely fantastic for API-based testing, load testing, and I see so many customers who've never used it. We run tests of many kinds. Ultimately, should they pass, we decide at that point to tear down the integration environment. We've got some confidence at this point with a successful execution of our tests that we're now ready for manual testing. We'll deploy this at this point to a dedicated testing environment, which QA will have access to. Now, before I jump ahead into the next environment, do we have any questions from the audience? Okay, everyone assumes my methodical madness is correct. Have you just found when you're trying to talk and drive at the same time that you end up just taking the wrong turn? Didn't really mean to come back that far out. So, jump into the QA environment. Much the same. We're deploying an ARM template again, creating a resource group to contain the website, doing token replacement. Just FYI, that's what the tokens are getting replaced. Good old regex, the blackest of arts. Now, after we've deployed this, just to complete the story, we kind of go back to our original build definition. So this task is another one authored by Richard, which looks at the primary artifact source for this release definition and increments one of the variables within that build definition. So I've done a successful deployment test. Now, whether or not test passed this or not is another matter entirely. However, one of the variables, just to ensure that our version numbers are incrementing correctly over time, will increment automatically, in this case, the minor variable. So, let's do a deployment. I'll go back to the pipeline, or rather, actually, the instance of the release.
Sorry, is the purpose of that incrementing the number to make sure that no release ends up in the same environment?
It's more that. So, build version numbers, major, minor, revision, increment.
Yeah.
So, assuming that this this particular release has passed test, or even if it's failed test, for argument's sake, and we're doing it of release, we want to at least mark that there's been the next release should be at least some functional change, as opposed to if we just build again, all we would find is the last part of the build number would increment again by the current process. I think it's when I've used a similar task in customer-facing deployment pipelines, it is really just so that they know that this is, for the purpose of release documentation, nobody thinks 5.4.3.4, sorry, non-technical customers, so your non-technical QA tester, they'll be thinking in major, minor. So, I've got 5.2 deployed to this environment. So, although not absolutely required, it is nice, I suppose, for just the purposes of informing the end users of a major change to that environment.
Just an indication of progress, basically.
Exactly. Okay. Now, something something will have it. Just because you can automate something doesn't always mean you should. That goes against what I said earlier. I said automate everything. I know, but hear me out. So we deployed to this integration environment automatically upon the primary build artifact getting a new version. The build definition finished, etc. We deployed to integrated dev. I did not automatically deploy to QA. Can anyone in the audience tell me why?
Yeah, the testers get grumpy.
Yeah, they get very grumpy. I used to be a tester. I'd get grumpy if, what do you mean you just deployed? I have to start again. So, and managers get very grumpy when you deploy to production automatically. So please be careful when you're configuring the pre and post deployment conditions for your release definitions. The nice would be for it to propagate through. It would not be nice in practice. So this is waiting for approval, funnily enough, before we can actually go to the next environment. I'm going to give an appropriately cryptic approval. Now,
Is that a plugin or is that just straight available?
Straight available. So there's a couple of ways you can actually configure approval groups. You can have only a single approver in the list you specify. Now this is best if your VSTS instance is probably backed by an Azure AD, but there's nothing stopping you just querying, I suppose, your live accounts. But yeah, we try to recommend customers don't use live backed VSTS instances. Point I'm making there, sorry. You can either have one approver approve the release, or you can have a mandated requirement that all approvers in the list have to approve the release. Potentially quite important for production releases. I have found in some cases, like in some customer departments, nobody really wants to be the only one approving the deployment because then it's potentially their head on the chopping block. So saying that everyone has to approve a release and that it's documented, obviously, through release history is quite attractive, where that kind of culture is in effect.
In terms of notifying people who need to approve, can that be hooked into work items or?
It's email-based alerts. So in this particular instance, it'll be obviously my workplace account. I'll spam Rick, Richard, and Mr. Gardner all at once, just like Rick was spamming me on Friday. Now, that, if I do a refresh, should have I count myself lucky. When Rick was demonstrating this last week, we had a VSTS outage. I don't know if anyone noticed. It was. I'm not sure how widespread the outage was in the end, but even I noticed it on customer site. It was at work. I noticed it on work items, but when releases, it couldn't. When I went to publish my artifact source back to VSTS, it was giving me the most arcane null reference error I've ever seen.
You have to say we've never seen that Edinburgh published that you just displayed on the screen. That didn't make its way to any of the environments last week.
Oh, bless. Oh well, I'll show you some. Let's show you some magic. So, if I go to logs, again, I love this new. Well, I say new. It's been around for a few years now, but the real time and verbosity of the logging you can get back from when you build and release stuff is just fantastic. But on a point, while we're talking about that, I have very much found that doing anything out of the box, anything that's more clever than out of the box, we're falling back a lot at Black Marble on PowerShell. We have a guy, Christopher Gardner, who's, well, even before he started working at Black Marble, he was my scripting guy. I'm know enough, quite enough to be dangerous in PowerShell. I'm a bit rough around the edges, admittedly, but we got our PowerShell expertise from our SharePoint practices. So ultimately propagated through the business. Everyone in Black Marble can write at least a bit of PowerShell. Some people can write a lot more. But all our build tasks, predominantly PowerShell driven. If you're not encouraging some level of scripting expertise in your organization at the moment, it's something you probably need to look to address, because getting the most out of the build and release system, you really do need, whether you're writing PowerShell, Bash, or even old batch files, some level of scripting expertise, I strongly implore you to start cultivating.
It's also really valuable using PowerShell because it goes into the other things like Octopus Deploy and things that you can put it on any of these platforms.
Yeah, and I found PowerShell's integration with the .NET framework really, really useful. I've been working on like a BizTalk deployment library, which I'm calling the BizTalk assemblies for doing stuff that's just not possible using WMI commandlets and the like. I could not do that in other scripting languages. I'd have to write my own command line executable, which is actually what I was looking to avoid. So we should, I think at this point, have we finished, or are we just waiting on waiting on Azure to feedback? I think the only little quibble I have with the logging feedback, sometimes I don't know if anyone who has played with this has noticed, if you start a release definition or a build definition, you don't quite catch the start of it. You don't get to see, the agent's like, I'll report back some output next time I start the next task. So you can sit here waiting for a little bit. Now, if needs be, we can spam this and see how it's coming along, whether we'll get a 503 or similar. Now you can see I browsed this earlier just to make sure it was alive and kicking. First things first, but you can tell quite clearly we're in a different environment. Again, config propagating up to the UI. Now, look at that. So, our change has propagated all the way through. Now I can go back to I can go back from a test or production environment, and even if I'm a tester and I've never seen the build and release, I've never seen the the GUI innards of our VSTS pipeline, I can say, right, well, I know that came from this build. Now that is a very simplification of a complex build and release pipeline. Everyday part of my job I've put in one's far more complicated, but I consider this approaching the minimum of what we should all be looking to employ. Everyone should be doing at least CI, continuous integration builds. Everyone should be looking to automate as much of a deployment process as possible. You might not be able to get everything done. I still have manual steps in some of my deployment pipelines where I've got to go and do manual intervention, but it's something I strive to work towards to get rid of those last manual steps. And ultimately, it leaves me in a better place than where I was previously. Now, I'm not going to so much go back into my full slide deck because I've only got a few slides left to show. A couple of I believe it was actually summerish last year. There was a DevOps airlift event here that Microsoft had a couple of the VSTS team guys come over, general QA and the like, and I couldn't quite find his name, but this phrase stuck with me: culture eats process. I've spent the last bit of time showing you tooling. I have come across challenges myself when I've wanted to put this kind of process in that I haven't had I get pushback from management because there is a startup time for putting a lot of these deployment frameworks in for each project. On where are your stakeholders seeing value? You have to try and sell them at this point that, well, yes, okay, I could spend 3-4 days working how to automate things deployment. I mean, you're not going to see anything, or I could spend an afternoon deploying it. But I'll do that every time I have to deploy it, and that will mount up, and that will detract from budgets of the projects we're working on. Fortunately, I don't get that kind of pushback at Black Marble, where we're a little bit more well grounded that, but on customer sites where I'm trying to recommend to put this in. If you don't have sufficient buy-in about people wanting to do things better, the best tools in the world will be as useless as a chocolate fire guard. So, nope, I'm not in the PowerPoint mode. The magic button doesn't do anything.
Phone number at the top.
I had no idea. I'll ignore that. It never happened. So, I think that was my summary, really, rather than skipping to the summary slide. By the way, if you've never met them, that's Rick, with also jokingly referred to as Old Me, and that's Richard, our Director of Engineering. Some useful links. So, I'm not much of a blogger. I'm looking to get back into it, but certainly Rick and Richard's blogs are constant hotbeds of cool and interesting things that we're doing. Our GitHubs. Most of the extensions that in fact, I think believe all the extensions that I've shown today that are authored by us are freely available in the marketplace. The source code for them is there, should you need them or want to modify them in your own way. We have at least a dozen or so in the marketplace that I haven't shown. Have a poke around, you might find something useful. Yeah, I suppose, last but by no means least, I hope in my ramblings I've kind of talked about some of the work that we do. And if there's anything what we can do, which is around helping get these DevOps processes in, assessing what you're currently doing, if there's recommendations we can help with, or if there's bespoke dev. We work across the Microsoft stack, SharePoint, SQL-ish, loads of Azure ARM in ARM templates these days. I will not go on about all the things we do, but that little lady over there, Amy, is the person to talk to if you think we might have a problem. You might have a problem we can help you with. So I suppose, if we're considering coffee break, I'll talk about some of the places where we have. We do generally we have a couple of case studies where we have put this kind of work in. Now, this customer I can't name due to NDA reasons, but they're in aerospace, which I can say. So they had issues where even deploying a single line of code to in their test environment could take upwards of about 6 months. This is because they didn't have enough environments. There was politics and play around who got access to them. And various software releases, funny enough, because testers were in the middle of testing such complex bits of software with their very large regression suites, holding up process. So we stepped in and, under our director of consultancy services, Rick's direction, we realized ARM was very much going to be the answer for that particular problem. So took a bit of work, but we got the deployment times down to a matter of hours. Provisioning environments, deploying their code into that environment, running their regressions, drastically reducing their regression tests by putting in proper test automation. So much so, ultimately that bit of work, I won as Partner of the Year award in 2015. Again, we're not really allowed to mention the customer's name overtly, but that's one of our kind of crown jewels of where this process put in properly, the returns, 6 months to 6 hours.